Welcome to another episode of The Insider. Today we have Robinson, the co-founder of Wormhole, one of the leading interop protocols in the ecosystem. Robinson, welcome to The Insider.
Thank you for having me. Excited to be here and chat more.
Yeah, so let's just get started. Tell us a bit about yourself. Like, how did you start in crypto? What are you building right now? What is Wormhole?
Yeah, absolutely. I'll try and be brief on the what is wormhole part. I'm sure we'll get in deeper, but I got into crypto back in probably like 2019, 2020. Prior to that, I had just been working in growth and go-to-market startups for a number of years. Some successful, had good exits, some not, and failed, which I feel like is good to kind of have the experience of both. Then I ended up in San Francisco at DoorDash for about 4 years. Focused a lot on the new verticals there within DoorDash. I actually spent the majority of my time on one product that we spent about 3 years building, which was the corporate side. So I worked on everything but the core business. So if you were to like go on right now and get a burrito delivered to your door, I didn't work on that, but we worked on how do you scale this to other business verticals. So the one, like I said, we were working on for a while was the corporate side of the business. So catering, coffee, labor as a service, these different type of businesses you could spin out from kind of the core gig economy model that DoorDash had developed at the time. That was a great experience. Felt like you kind of had the backing of a very large company and got to experiment with like a number of different startups. I had gotten into crypto in actually 2017 personally. I started mining Ethereum when that was a thing. Funny enough, I don't think a lot of people know this, but my girlfriend at the time helped co-found like a housing startup within the Bay Area. Back then, during that time, the Bay Area had a lot of it was really expensive. It still had this like mind share. Everyone was coming there. It was pre-COVID, so it was still popular. And so like everyone that wanted to build a business was there. So they started this housing company, and we lived that company. What I mean by that is like we would live in these like big houses, these like commune type houses, and I got to meet a lot of different people. And of course, I met someone that was really into the crypto, and they were starting mining. And I was like, "What is this? What are you doing?" And then I kind of was red pilled or blue pilled, whatever you want to call it, from there, orange pilled maybe. And then that was in 2017, but at the time DoorDash was still doing really well. So I was like, I'm not going to leave this. This is doing great. But I still kept that interest for a while until after the IPO and DoorDash went public. I started to look around within the space, and I said, where are there like interesting things or meaningful things that I could do? And for me, interoperability was always top of mind. I know at the time we kind of have a meme, or right now we have a meme around infrastructure. There's too much infrastructure, not enough consumer. But back then it was like, what is the picks and shovel play? What is infrastructure here? And you started to see this proliferation of chains, and interoperability was really interesting to me. So long story short, I started within the Polkadot ecosystem, helped launch chain called Akala there, which was one of the early app chains. I think it was the first, and was really interested in just like the app chain thesis. Gavin Wood, obviously, big part of Ethereum, and then came over to build Polkadot, and the thesis was, Ethereum's not going to scale. We're going to build Polkadot. It will scale. Fast forward to Wormhole. I ended up joining Jump, and we'll get into kind of the Wormhole's history there. Jump had incubated Wormhole. And now today, if you fast forward, we're connected to almost 40 chains. We do a lot at the messaging layer, the asset layer, and we can, of course, get more into the details. But hopefully that's a little bit of a helpful background, and happy to dive in anywhere.
Yeah, I mean, that was a brilliant background. Like, how old were you when you were working for DoorDash?
Good question. I think I started there when I was 24.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm 31 now. Not a lot of people know that. Putting my age on blast.
No, I'm just like, I asked that because so you were pretty young at that point, and you were at DoorDash just building their B2B side of the business. And it seems like that was kind of foundational in your founder experience in a way, because you got to start a lot of things on your own.
Absolutely. Yeah. It was almost a cheat code, honestly, because, and I think it's a good, actually, like career arbitrage play where you have this big company that it, has a core business, you have this kind of like security blanket, if you will, but then within that, you can be part of this like, subsect of the company that's trying new things. And a lot of larger Web2 companies have that. For instance, like Google has, we've all heard of like the moonshot projects, things of the such. And so it was really interesting because we could have the safety of failing a little bit more than you could if you were starting from scratch, raising money, and really kind of like looking at the run rate month by month. So that was definitely a good opportunity.
And then when you joined crypto, your first project was Akala, that was in the Polkadot ecosystem. And all of us know how big Polkadot has been on Interop. Like a lot of people would say that is where everything started. The concept of bridges, just like the chain of chain concepts. So do you think that played a big role in how you see Interop today?
Yeah, absolutely. And also made me realize like how early the technology was. Like we, in some capacities. So if you're not familiar, Polkadot calls their interchain communication XCM. And I think Polkadot from a technology perspective was actually early and first on a lot of things. But what's interesting about this space is tech is unfortunately only 50% of the equation. Marketing and things like that are the other 50%. But seeing the value in being able to have all of these kind of different chains, different businesses, and then being able to connect them and almost, I hate to use this word, but we'll probably use it a lot, like abstract a lot of that away, I think was really powerful. But one thing I noticed was like there were still a lot of challenges. And so specifically with connecting Polkadot to the outside ecosystem, I view crypto as almost like lands, and they're all, how are the lands connected? Everyone has their like visual and mental analogies, and Polkadot in particular was leading, but it was still having trouble like connecting to chains, right? Data, assets, how do you batch transactions? The most important thing, or the biggest thing that was missing, was like the connection outside. And there was inherent problems from the start. For instance, let's say Wormhole would connect to one app chain. What about all the other apps, right? You kind of almost have to compose a number of different transactions, work across different messaging protocols, and it got really messy. Liquidity fragmentation proliferated. So I definitely think that was where I started to get even more interested in like, oh, there's a lot of problems here, and it obviously led to more.
So how did you go from Polkadot to Solana? Because like Polkadot has this vision of chains, and then Solana is totally on the other side of the spectrum. So how did you make that jump?
Yeah, it was literally jump. It was a jump. So I guess maybe a little bit of like origin story with Wormhole maybe would be helpful too. So funny enough, I don't think a lot of people know this, but Wormhole actually sponsored the first ever Solana hackathon. If you look at the first Solana hackathon, it's like, I think it's Solana and Wormhole, and yeah, that it was back in, I don't know, 2019 or whatever the year was. So it was very like core to Solana's like start. Wormhole was, and the reason why was there needed to be a way to connect this like hub, this island of liquidity, which was Ethereum at the time, to this new up and coming chain, Solana. And there were actually three developers, engineers that built the first iteration of Wormhole. First iteration was only an asset bridge; it wasn't even messaging. And the idea was that they just were solving a problem. Like, how do we get liquidity from Ethereum, where it all lives, to Solana, this new chain? And that was called Certus 1 at the time. Jump saw the opportunity here, that hey, this is great for between these two chains, and also there was an incentive alignment with Solana and the success there, but also like this could potentially be more. And you kind of fast forward a little bit from Certus 1, once it kind of Jump kind of acquired it, decided to incubate it, we changed it to Wormhole, and then launched what we called V2 at the time, which was messaging, so being able to send arbitrary payloads, and 20 chains later, probably like a year after that, we added additional 20 chains, and it kind of became much more than this. Like what I saw was like very opportunistic. It was like, we just want to solve this one problem, which is how do we connect these two ecosystems to get assets going back and forth. And then when I joined Jump around that time, I was just primarily focused on how do we now productize this? Okay, we solved this one problem. How do we now take what is the vision of Wormhole, right? And I think at the time, Origin is like, I'm sorry to be long-winded here, but at the time, multi-chain was like, it was a hot take. Like there was a lot of people that did not believe we would be in a multi-chain world. Truly, like it was probably split on CT. In fact, it was probably leaned more on like everything's going to be built on this world computer that is Ethereum. And it was a huge bet. In hindsight, people are like, oh, interop's huge, or like now people like interop's huge. But in hindsight, it was like, no, this is a huge bet you're taking. So when we were like kind of sat down and thinking like, what is the future of Wormhole look like? Expanding to 20 chains and this like vision took time to actually get to. It wasn't just like obvious, right? So that's like a little bit about the backstory. Obviously, we were kind of incubated at Jump for a while. A lot of the team focused and built Wormhole there, but today we're completely spun out to 4 different entities.
Mm-hmm. So I feel like you saw a small problem, like how do you connect Solana to the chain with the most capital, and then kind of laid the groundwork for what Wormhole is today, right? And like you said, multi-chain was a hot take back then. I feel like I personally resonated with it because I was using Solana and all of my funds were on Ethereum, right? So as a user, I knew there was a place for something like Solana because I just liked the user experience. There were NFT mints. Like I would be up at 3 a.m. just trying to mint some new NFT. So it just felt like a different vibe, right? And that was pretty much it. That was my thesis of like, okay, there will be multiple chains, and that's how I reached out to Philip and got started at LI.F 3 years ago. And it feels like your thesis was also simple in a way, and now it has just evolved to so much more. And I want to get more into that, right? Like, so Wormhole today is a multi-billion-dollar company, and it's so much more than just connecting Solana to Ethereum. So, how do you see Wormhole's role today compared to what you envisioned early on?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think in the space changes rapidly, and so you kind of sometimes have to place bets on direction. Like that's ultimately like sometimes part of the calculus, right? But I think at the start, it was very much so focused on assets. It was like, how do we just get assets from to your point, you were doing DeFi on Solana. How do you get all your assets from Ethereum to Solana? And I actually like to go over kind of the asset transfer history, the lock and mints, which I know you know very well, to the burn and mint, to the composing some sort of burn and mint or lock and mint with the swap to intents and all that stuff. And we can get into that. But at the time, like, it just is like, let's lock and mint and get these assets over there. However, we saw this really big opportunity for this messaging primitive, right? And I think now, again, that's something that's a lot obvious to a lot of people. And I'll get into how our thoughts have shifted a little bit. But so we were like, messaging is extremely important. All these applications, are deploying to one chain. Chains they're kind of like closed off ecosystems in a way, and they're eventually going to want to get to more users, more liquidity. And that thesis has generally played out. Like if you're an application on one chain, you want to be on more because they're kind of like moats for liquidity and users. And so, being able to have this like messaging primitive so you could build applications with, we thought was really important. So we launched V2, which was messaging. And then you kind of fast forward today to how we view Wormhole's transition from what I would call, it still is a protocol by definition, but we kind of view it more as a platform. And so Wormhole is a platform with a lot of different products. I think the way the like company comparison I like to think about is like Stripe, right? Like if I'm an entrepreneur, which a lot of builders on chain are, we call them builders, developers. I kind of think through the lens of entrepreneur just because it helps you envision what their problems might be a little bit more. If I'm an entrepreneur, and let's say I'm in Web 2, I want to launch a site or something like that. Stripe is it's a platform that has everything payments. If you go on their website, it's like 9 different products, right? It's like a checkout SDK. It's an embeddable widget. It's an on and off ramp. And so when we think about Wormhole, the direction we've kind of pushed it in, it went from like, send a message and then, be able to bridge funds to now it's like, here are 6 or 7 different multi-chain things, right? So you could have a lock and mint bridge. You could have a burn and mint standard. You could have poll-based queries. You could have push-based messaging. You can have relays as a service. You can have multi-chain governance, right? And so like we started kind of pushing in this direction of how do we help anyone that wants to do anything multi-chain with like these almost out of the box products. And I think I do kind of push us also in the direction of thinking like Stripe, right? Like messaging will be commoditized. And I think we could probably have a conversation on that, or maybe it even is. So what are all the things you provide around that add value? That I think is the most important. And that's what we focus on a lot. So network expansion is great. I think a lot of people view interop through the lens of like, how many chains are you connected to? I do think that's important. Sometimes I feel like it's a little bit of a red herring. We've done some data on the chains in which Wormhole's connected to, like of all on-chain activity, how much is of those chains, what is Wormhole connected to? The number comes in, it varies anywhere from like 93 to 95%. And Wormhole's connected to, I think it's like 38 chains. It's not the most in the industry, but there's a lot of nuance when we look into that number, right? It's like, okay, but it is 95% of activity. And also of the other protocols out there that have chain connections, how much of the stack is actually live, right? Like it's one thing to deploy an endpoint. It's another thing to deploy a token bridge, to have automatic relaying, to have front ends and those various things. So I'm kind of getting on a tangent a little bit here, but I think in summary, it's like we went from asset transfer, which is important, to messaging, to, okay, this is going to be commoditized. What are the things we need to build around it to make it more important and more meaningful? And so that's the kind of transition we've gone to a platform. And then I have a hot take on messaging, but I'll save that one.
I mean, so like you said, messaging can be commoditized, but I feel like that's a take we have for almost everything in crypto, right? Like at one point we're talking about chains will be commoditized. So what can actually be monetized? Like you said, it's the stuff that you build around that service. But do you think that's actually the way to go about it, or I don't know how to phrase this properly, but it's like every team that's building, after one point, they feel like, okay, everyone is doing this, right? Like that's where the meme comes from. Everyone is building the same thing. So every team just goes into that direction. Okay, how do we add more value? How do we improve the customer experience? So do you think that's the way most crypto companies are going today? Or is there a way to just monetize the core value proposition of the protocol?
I'd say the former. So when I think about interoperability in particular, like let's just say your general message passing, maybe we should align on like how we view the stack, right? I kind of view it as like messaging, assets, and then aggregation, if you will. There's like a little bit of a blend here, but like
Yeah.
that's generally how we view it. At some point, like all of the messaging protocols, if you notice, they all, and you obviously you guys notice this, they all have to have an asset component. And the reason why is because messaging is, and I'll answer your question more directly, but messaging, we talked about how it's potentially commoditized, but there's also a bet on what the future will look like when it comes to messaging, right? It's like, you can hear a lot of different maybe pitches from different founders, but it's this idea that like messaging will help kind of serve all these various actions in the background, give this unified experience to users. I don't necessarily believe that that's not the case. In fact, we are kind of marching towards that vision. I think there's a big bet on gaming, social, all these other things. But I think what's most important is to be realistic, especially when you're building a company in this space, being realistic about the short-term value. That is assets, right? And so when we think about the messaging layer, it's no coincidence that every big interop player is also coupled with, right? Like it's different in terms of how how the entities are set up and things like that, but like they're coupled with an asset bridge. And the reason why is because that is where all the value is. Like, you have your layer 0 Stargate, your Axelar Squid, your Wormhole portal. We actually are trying to invest in multiple. We want builders to come out. Like Mayan is a team we're working really closely with now. And the reason why is because like all the value is still happening at the asset layer, right? That's what people care about. We're all trading tokens, those things, like that is what's happening right now. So I think for us, we're focusing on like value accrual around the asset layer. But I think just stepping back more broadly, how we think about things at Wormhole is that we are in a network effects game. And I even think about this when it comes to monetization, right? Like sometimes on CT, et cetera, people talk about revenue and they'll kind of give sometimes people have takes and give people a hard time, protocols a hard time that don't make revenue, things like that. I think for chains, maybe it's a little bit more straightforward in terms of the monetization and sequencer fees, all of that. I think apps, we can have a conversation around apps. Also makes a little bit more sense, especially DeFi, right? Like fees on exchange for swaps, etc. I think for interoperability protocols, the thesis has to be a little bit different because the value accruals as the network expands. The more you secure, the more developers using your semantics, the more front ends and things like that. That is how you kind of accrue value over time. I think about it like an Uber, right? Like Uber's CAC spend or customer acquisition costs is through the roof because they knew that like they first of all, they had to beat out taxi, but they had to establish this insane network because the more network effects, the more you could do, the more you could monetize, the more you could, more drivers you could get, et cetera. And I actually think interop, at least at like the very base layer, at the messaging layer, has to be thought of similarly. And that's why we moved to this platform approach where we provide all these products. You can maybe vertically integrate a lot of the products, and then monetization becomes a lot easier, right? You can accrue value because if you use one thing, it composes with all these other things. But at the end of the day, the one thing that I think is really important that you guys do a great job of is there's no substitute for owning the customer, right? Like the front ends and the distribution, I think are increasingly important, especially as we move more towards assets being like the main focus. And I know some people will argue like the Hart Brian argument is like effectively like Hart is saying assets are really, the main use case, which I do agree with. And Brian's saying like, yes, but you need messaging for that. And I don't want to put words in their mouth. And also there's this future of messaging as well that like is coming with games and things like that, right? There has to be this bet for the business on that future. And so not sure I'm answering your question directly, but more so like giving you an insight on like how we think about things. And yeah.
I feel like you can almost look at a protocol like Wormhole as a chain and the ecosystem that develops around it, right? So at this point, there are probably, I don't know, 50 to 100 applications that are built on Wormhole in some way or another. That's actually more than a lot of the chains out there, right? So I feel like that's the best way to look at some of these interop protocols as a platform that you can build an application on top, and then you guys being the platform here have to provide some of the additional services, right? So that the overall experience to the user and then your customer, the applications, is also just better.
Yeah, absolutely. And then the more critical mass you can get, then you can start to say, okay, we have these two products. They're best in the industry, or they're absolutely needed. Like there's value that accrues there, right? Like you've kind of hit this critical mass of like someone building and they're using all the products, and you have these two things they really need. It's almost like a freemium model in a way, right? Like I think queries is a good example. It's like I don't know too much about the competitive landscape, like, or I know it intimately well, but specifically with pull-based messaging is something we're focused on a lot, or one of the things we are. And so like that could be something that's interesting, right? It's like, okay, I think about it almost like as an API call. And then it's like you can stake a certain amount or pay per API call, right? And then that becomes more interesting. But I think we're still early. And I may get some flack for this because people are gonna be like, oh, when is these things gonna make money? But like we're still early for interop in particular. Again, because network effects are so important. And adoption and integrations are key, and any barrier to that for Wormhole or any other interop protocol, I would say, is a hindrance to growth and future product market fit.
I feel like we're definitely early, and we're not. If you look at some of the tech companies like Facebook or just like pure tech companies, they take somewhere around 7 to 11 years to actually start monetizing and become revenue generating machines. So I feel like our protocols are probably 4 or 5 years old at best, right? So that there's enough time to actually monetize. And right now, what's more important is, like you said, network effects, building distribution, onboarding more developers. So I'm totally with you on that. Just another question on this would be, like, I feel like a lot of people have been talking about ZK in terms of interop, but I've been hearing about it for the last 2 years, and I personally haven't seen any application of ZK in interop. So is that also a meme, or will it actually happen at some point? Because I see Wormhole has been focusing on ZK in their roadmap. So maybe give us a sense of like where does that stand today, and is it realistic to expect it sometime soon in the future?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'll take a little bit of a step back and probably lean into a theme that you guys have been paying close attention to, which is this idea of modular security, which I think is really important. ZK is just one way to like share the state, right? And I know you've written a lot about this, but like it is considered more of a trustless way instead of ultimately trusting a few parties, multi-sigs, if we just really get down to it. I think the broader theme and the more important thing is this idea of modular security. And I think like understanding where that is going is something we think about a lot, right? Like for instance, we are very proud and continue to put a lot of work behind the Guardian network. The Guardian network, yes, you could be reductive and say it's a multi-sig, sure. But it is a 19 of some of the largest staking providers in the space. 13 out of 19 come to consensus on every single message that goes through. And we would consider it a very good, like, yes, it's 19, it's not 100 plus, but it's a very good and robust compromise, realistic commercial, something that's able to be commercialized compromise for security. And having that as like a core part of the Wormhole network, I think is really important. We have no desire or plans around kind of like limiting that or stopping work on that or anything like that. We think the Guardian network and having that security is important. And look, we're already seeing people use it, right? Like I know Hyperlink has a module to use the Guardian network. So I think that's an important piece, is like having one really good core piece of security and not just saying like, you guys go figure it out. Here's one like, really small part, small party multi-sig. Because what happens is app developers, et cetera, like they never really prioritize that, right? Like they don't want to do extra infrastructure efforts if they don't have to. And ultimately in aggregate, they won't. But anyway, also I'll start by saying like, we're going to continue to do work on the Guardian network, but modular security is interesting, right? It's like ultimately what I think it does is it solves scaling. So when we think about connecting to chains, we could probably have a whole discussion on how many chains there are going to be. But let's say there are a lot. There already are a lot, but like let's say there continues to be more. How do you scale to all of those networks in a way where you're not sacrificing security? It's typically kind of like using the security that is available, or the most robust security that's available, right? And so we've thought a lot about modular security. Obviously, there's already some teams that do it at the messaging layer, as I think about it. For us, we're starting at the asset layer. And the reason we're doing that is because we think that there is the most value. Like that is what people care about the most, right? So like we can get into NTT, but like NTT uses modular security. So with the recent Lido launch, it uses both Wormhole and Axelar, and you need a 2 of 2 in order to perform a mint. And you can actually take Wormhole out entirely. I know you've been doing research on this. But I say all that. I'll get into ZK because I think it's important. Like there's like a strategy going on, right, about like how you go to market around modular security. Yeah. And I think our strategy is generally like we do want to own a core security component, and then also we were going to start at the asset layer because we think it's kind of like where more of the value is. Look, ZK is an interesting space because it's definitely susceptible to memes. It kind of reminds me of some chains that have supposed to launch for a very long time that still haven't. That still have a lot of support behind them though. I'll say kind of a few things. One is that we still have a couple dedicated teams. We do have a couple dedicated teams working on ZK daily. We are code complete on an Ethereum light client. We're close on a few non-EVM networks. I think the thing that we're working on more now is the actual composability, right? So like effectively what you're saying is like you're getting a ZK proof to like ultimately share state and then perform whatever you want on top of it, like an asset transfer. What we're working on now is like being able to actually, instead of using the Guardian network, be able to use said ZKP in order for that attestation to happen. So in summary, like it is still happening. We feel like it's important to be a part of it and work on it. Lurk Labs, they now just changed to Argument Computer Corp. Full time is working on ZK on a couple corridors for us near Aptos Ethereum is where we're starting. But I think the thing where we're at now is like, okay, building these light clients was difficult. That's what we've been working on for 2 years. Now, how do you slot it in this infrastructure? But I think the more important thing at a high level is like, is all of the security out there and being able to use that within these stacks? Because we talk a lot about like semantics and everything built around the network, the products. You need to have like a very like modular stack so that you can expand quickly and all those things can compose and follow. So I'm not sure that answers your question entirely, but the last thing I'll say too is that there's also a world where there's a lot of teams working on ZK, right? Like there's actually no shortage of proofs. There's a shortage of distribution. And that's actually like, again, I'm going on a little bit of a diatribe here, but like, that's actually why Eigen, like, or these restaking protocols, if I were to say like, if I were to be in the room with them, they probably built like an Eigen DA, right? They're like, we need distribution for this security, an AVS as they call it. Bridges are actually like the best AVS possible, right? It's like they have like all this distribution, all these asset transfers, use cases, and a need for security, and now they're becoming modular. So ZK, I think about ZK and restake security and all these things in a very kind of similar way. And with ZK in particular, I don't think there's going to be any shortage of proofs, people working on a way to like, prove something. I think there's going to be a shortage of distribution. And so we've definitely continued to focus on building out these light clients, but I think we've subtly or slowly kind of shifted the focus more to like continuing to make Wormhole these like distribution rails, knowing that the proofs will come. People are working on them, teams are working on them. But yeah, sorry, that was long-winded, but it is still a little bit of a meme. But in 2025, we will have actually on testnet by the end of this year, we'll be able to, there'll be a message verified via ZKP that we've kind of like one of the core contributors have done. I know there's like Polyhedra and some of these other ones out there, but yeah.
No, I think you answered my question perfectly, to be honest, because I feel like it's a very pragmatic way to look at things, right? Like you cannot build ZK tech overnight. It's of course going to take 2 to 3 years. So I feel like this modular approach, so like how I look at it is trust is a spectrum, and then security is also a spectrum. So you guys are working on one part of security yourself, but then you're also opening up your protocol or opening up Wormhole to have the best security at that time. And then you're also investing on ZK, which could potentially be one of the best security stacks in the future, right? So I feel like you're working on it from all different angles. Like, of course, you have to run a protocol today. So you're focusing on just ensuring that that provides the best security with your Guardian set, but you're investing heavily on the future security. And that's the most practical way to go about it.
Yeah. And I think you have to ultimately place some bets, right? And then shift resources as things start to pan out, especially in this space. Anyone who tells you that they know what 3 years from now is going to look like, they make it close. Don't get me wrong, but like things shift so much. Like we used Web 2 analogies that are partially correct, right? Not entirely. So it's like actually doesn't pan out the same. And so for us, a lot of it is placing bets and then, being comfortable allocating resources quickly. Like we're still absolutely like invested in ZK in a big way, but we have to start thinking from the perspective of, the most important thing we can do is be strong distribution rails for security. And we also think it's important to own security, but there's a lot of other teams building ZK, right? So like maybe we can lean on some of those teams and we can just be composable with what they're building. So it's like, it's a little bit of you're placing some bets and then allocating resources based on how kind of things start panning out. But yeah, I think it's a good strategy to date.
Yeah, I think placing bets is also a luxury, right? Like Wormhole is probably one of the best funded teams in the interop ecosystem. So I kind of want to talk about that a little bit. in the sense that how does having funding and like a secure runway of a few years kind of frees you up to place some of these bets? How important do you think something like that is in a space like crypto that changes every 2 years?
Yeah, absolutely. First of all, it's a privilege working with everyone on the team. The team is, by the way, our entire team is about 85 people now. So and that's globally distributed across 4 different teams. Like actually, very decentralized. So it's just a privilege to be able to get here and work on this. Look, I think this goes back to what I said about network effects, right? Like being able to get ahead, do well with your core product, get ahead, get funding, kind of like it is actually going back to DoorDash, right? You have a core product, you can get a lot of funding, you can do well, you can hit a product market fit, right? And then what happens is like you continue to invest building network effects. As new things come along, you're in a better position to invest in them. For instance, I remember when Succinct came out, and we work closely with the Succinct team, by the way, great team. And we were like, oh wow, ZK bridging, like this is a thing. Like this, like I remember we had already been doing some research about it, but like seeing some of the progress that they made. But what's interesting is like once you hit a critical mass, you're able to invest in these things, and a lot of times like make progress faster or like get involved in a meaningful way. And so I think it's important for us to always focus on like core business stuff, because that is bread and butter. That's what's going to put food on the table. That's what's going to help us grow, right? So like I would say adoption all across our core products, like very, very crucial. But always making sure that we have a strong research arm and understanding where things are going and then invest accordingly is definitely a privilege, but it hasn't been something that like we've kind of fallen into luckily per se. It's like we focused on let's get this core business going, and now we're able to kind of have the luxury to place a little bit more bets. So yeah, I think this goes back to the fact that like network effects in this space, in this business are important, but you can't lose sight of the core business. And we did that for a while. For a while, it was like asset transfers and just some messaging use cases, right? Like for a while, it was a lot of our stuff was like Pith and Uniswap, really just focused on those. And then like as much asset transfer as possible, right? Owning assets, if you will. Doing that as much as possible, day after day, laser focus. That was probably like a year and a half. That's all we did. And that still is a lot of what we do, right? But like you just get to, and then you get to this point, and then now it's time to like start placing some bigger bets. And we are placing a number of them and making a few hot takes, because you have to be a leader, not a follower, right? And if you're constantly competitor obsessed, focusing on what the competitor is doing, you'll actually never be in a position to lead. You have to come to your own conclusions, your own versions of what the future could be, not just saying like, oh, they did this, we're going to copy pasta that, essentially, which is easy to do in our position, right? Or in any privileged, well-funded position, to just copy pasta what someone's doing. You actually want to see how you can do it better, then go to market with it.
Makes sense. Oh, by the way, just a side note, I feel like Wormhole's research and some of the security researchers, they do a really good job. And I don't know, they've saved so many bridge hacks, and this kind of goes under the radar. But yeah, I feel like your research team does a brilliant job, and they should be much more recognized in the space because they keep us safe in a way.
Arjun, I love that you said that. It's funny, like not even 2 weeks ago, we were in a call and we were just like, how do we get asymmetric research, more candidly? They have more work than they need, right? Like they actually don't need to be marketed for more business or anything like that. Like they contribute to some of the most important projects on chain, like FireDancer, the second validator client for Solana, Pith. I think they're starting to work with Jito more. We have their core contributor to Wormhole. We have some dedicated people there, but it's actually insane the stuff that this team does. JC, the CEO, he is like one of the best operators. He was the CISO at Mozilla Firefox, coupled with Felix, the CTO. Not a lot of people know this, but I won't say who, but on the team, the top Immunify bug bounty person is that individual. They found infinite mint errors with BNB, just found one in CCTP.
Yeah.
And I think they take a very like, grow the pie, player helping player type mentality, because especially for Wormhole, if we're connected to so much, if there's a vulnerability even on BNB, that's going to ultimately affect us. That's the selfish view. And then the like more altruistic view is that it's just obviously the less hacks, the better for the whole industry, because we don't end up on the news over and over. People are like, there's another crypto hack.
Yeah, I feel like they go under the radar, and I'm glad we could just like mention them here. But yeah, so just another like personal question. I feel you guys have built a multi-billion-dollar business, right? So as a founder in this space, how does that feel? Because once you started, when you started, it was just a bet, and today you've done your airdrop, you've gone through so many milestones. On a personal level, like how satisfying is that, and how much stress do you go through on a daily basis? Because I know being a founder cannot be easy in crypto.
Yeah, good question. It's a hard one to answer, but I'll start by saying, and I know I already said this, like it absolutely is a privilege. Like I'm obsessed with Wormhole and the team. Like I think obsessed is the right word. But look, I think that a lot of founders have this like chip on their shoulder where it doesn't seem like it is as big as it is, if that makes sense. Like to me, we're absolutely still in startup mode, and that's how we function. You ask anyone that works on Wormhole, we function like a startup, like this is just the beginning, because we do think this is just the beginning. And it's probably more glamorous than it seems from the or less glamorous, I'm sorry, than it seems from the outside, right? Like I think that in a perfect world, you want to think that being a founder, building a company, you can maintain like this healthy, balanced lifestyle. Maybe my hot take is like, there's no free lunch. Like there is a lot of sacrifice. And there's a lot of like hard points. And I think any founder will tell you that. So I'm not trying to like, just use things that probably a lot of people will say, but like, it's just, you just have to come to terms with that. You will make sacrifices. There's no world, in my opinion, where you can build a very successful company and have like a very good work-life balance. And that's just the truth. And maybe people will be like, challenge that. I'm sure there are people that have done it in some capacity, but I think that would be the exception to the rule. But I think in summary, like just to kind of reiterate, like it's an absolute privilege. Everyone here does think it's just the beginning. That's not a meme. Like we very much so think on like, I'm shipping stuff for Breakpoint and Token. I'm thinking that short term, we got a lot to do, but like we do think on a decade-long time horizon, right? Like how is the Wormhole Foundation almost like a Swift or something like that in terms of like really being a big part of the overall interop community, whatever it looks like in 10 years, right? But still being influential and a big part of that. We do think about that. So yeah, I think it's just the beginning. We still are very much so startup mindset. Everyone here is, and it's not as glamorous as it probably seems, but I'm extremely grateful and I wouldn't be doing anything else. But I think we shouldn't fool ourselves that like there is no sacrifice, because there definitely is. You can tell by the black circles under my head.
No, I feel like in crypto, we're so immune to valuations that when you think about it, there are so many billion-dollar protocols, right? And that's such a huge achievement in anyone's life. But in crypto, it's just like, okay, it's just a billion-dollar protocol, right? But if you tell that to your friends outside of crypto, I'm sure they'll be very proud of you, and they should be. Like, you should be proud of that achievement.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, valuations are lost on us in this industry. It's crazy. It is crazy.
But so like, how do you de-stress? What does your weekend look like?
Yeah. Oh, good. Let's get personal. This is great. Yeah, I think for me, I work 6 days a week. So I work Monday through Friday and Sunday. I mean, when I'm working Sunday, I'm not, in the office 7 to 6 p.m. Right? Like I'm catching up on things, but I am prioritizing working that day. But one thing I always try to do is I always hold Saturdays for family and friends, but also I actually believe that I need it. Even if I feel like, stress is here, we have so much to do, I will perform worse, make worse decisions, be a worse human if I work 7 days straight. And so I think it's important, and probably a lot of people need to do this, but maybe don't realize it, but like holding like one day a week or the majority of a day, maybe to kind of just take a break or do whatever helps you de-stress is important. Yes, you may not get as much as you need to do done like tactically on your whatever's on your to-do list, but I think it pays dividends in the long run. So I always try to protect Saturday. For me, I'm online so much that I try to just basic stuff. I try to touch grass. I'm in Lisbon mainly, so going out in the ocean. I'll try to surf with some friends, spend time with family, spend time with friends. I like to cook a lot. So go to the grocery store, get ingredients for a meal,
What's
like
your favorite dish to cook?
Well, right now I'm on a dip and soup, I would say dip. So I've been making lots of different dips, like baba ganoush, different hummuses, but like adding in like, a roasted red pepper flare. I've been making like whipped eggplant dips, like a lot. I would say a lot of like Mediterranean-esque is kind of like what I've been doing lately. So yeah, I go through phases. And then I'll try to copy some stuff at restaurants.
Yeah.
Like I had a really good dip at a place in Los Angeles recently, and so I've been trying to perfect that recipe. Yeah.
Awesome. And like, do you like to travel? Because I feel like in crypto, everyone is a part-time traveler, and founders have to travel a lot, right? So what's your take on that?
I'm like this is maybe a toxic trait of mine, but I'm like a light at the end of the tunnel person. So I'm like, maybe in 3 years I won't have to travel that much, which helps me justify traveling so much right now. I have a love-hate relationship with it. I imagine a lot of other people do too. I really try to prioritize behind the computer time or like in-person team time. And then, yeah, of course, I think it's important to be in a lot, not a lot, maybe like a select few conferences a year. And then from a business strategy perspective, how do you have a presence? Maybe it's not a founder or an executive, but it's like a presence at a number of conferences, especially like developers and hackathons. If you are someone who needs developers and building with whatever you've built. So yeah, I would say I have a love-hate relationship. I travel a lot right now. I do want to figure out a way in maybe 3 years time to do a little bit of less, like I said, light at the end of the tunnel. But I think it's important really to go to like the main conferences, maybe like 5 a year, and have some sort of high ROI activity, right? Whether you're speaking a number of times, meetings, and I even tell this to the team, right? Like whoever's going to conferences, what are your top 3 goals? We don't go to conferences just to yap and go to side events, although that's fun. You definitely do that, but don't do it if you haven't hit whatever your 3 goals are, right? Your 3 priorities. And so like we usually always have that in top of mind going into any event.
I feel like having a global team really helps just cover all the conferences, right? Because let's say you're in Lisbon, so you can cover Europe, but then someone in Asia can just do that part of the world. It just helps a lot because some of the flights are like 20 hours and then you're just traveling for 2 days.
Totally. And like I said, I have a love-hate relationship. Like I do think that I'm like, damn, I wish I was behind the computer like working this whole week. But the one thing is because we are so globally distributed and a lot of people work so close together and it's a smaller industry, I think though a lot of the reason we do it is because like we don't spend a lot of time in person. And I think there's no substitute for in-person time. I think that that's one of the unfortunate maybe externalities of a lot of like decentralized work is that you don't have as much of that. I'm definitely a big believer in like autonomy and remote work, but I'm also a huge believer in working in person as much as you can. There's no substitute for that type of work.
Yeah, I feel like some of those bonds you can only make in person, right? Like let's say you go on a retreat, you have a really good night where you drink with your colleagues, and then that ends up being like the night you bond, and then you go back home and you're like, I'm gonna fight for this guy, or like I'm gonna work for this guy.
Yeah, absolutely. I think you said it perfectly. That type of stuff is so important. And then the other thing I'll say too is like we just did a huge offsite with the Wormhole team recently. The first time I think in a while, at least at the current scale we're at, we've all been together. And there was just no substitute for being able to like we got a bunch of rooms and sessions and stuff, but like a lot of working time. I got so much done in a shorter period of time by just like hopping over to talk to someone in person for like really quick about something. And then you kind of like that type of workflow, I just think is really important. And while we're decentralized or distributed, like we definitely are going to try and kind of take this hub approach of having people working in certain areas across the world.
Got it. Makes sense. So like I'm just gonna wrap this up soon, but I want to ask you one last question. What do you wish for crypto to be in a year from now? Let's say we get back on another episode, and then what do you feel like the state of crypto should be at that point for you to feel like, okay, I've contributed to this space and moved it in the right direction?
Oh, this is a hard question. Also, I feel like there's a lot more we could cover. There's a lot more like juicy stuff, so we may need to do another one of these because I want to get into NTT frameworks. I want to get into PvP. I want to get into endgame for interop. But anyway, we'll save that for the next one. This is a good question. Look, I think a lot of people really want to see this idea of everything's on chain. It almost like replaces your phone. All these applications you use on your phone is you just like replace the back end with blockchains, right? Like I think that's ideal. Like sure, that's maybe an ideal outlook, maybe far into the future. I think for me right now, I'm pretty satisfied and comfortable knowing that look, we're placing bets on games, we're placing bets on social, we're placing all these different bets. But I'm really focused on like the financialization aspect. And I think a lot of people demonize the fact that a lot of crypto is really focused on DeFi, really focused on assets. Number one, it has to be, right? Because like these tokens are literally like the economic incentives to help these protocols run. So it's inherently going to be financialized. It just isn't the same financialization is like a TradFi, but it like these are supposed to have more utility than actually just being things that you trade in stores of value, right? And so like I don't know, I tend to lean in a little bit more to the fact and that it is okay that in a year from now institutions are actually on chain. And I think this is another thing, another meme too that's interesting is like we've been hearing like institutions are coming, etc. Something else we've been hearing for a while is AI, right? And I think like a lot of people think about it in the sense that like overnight there's a difference. Like AI, you'll often hear like, oh my God, AI is going to take away these 10 million jobs. It doesn't happen. But what happens is that you look back over a decade time horizon and you go, oh wow, AI literally wiped out like the quick serve restaurant, staff industry, right? Like it declined 50%. That is like attributable. That is how these things typically happen. And I think the same goes for like the institutions are coming type narrative in the sense that like, 2017 we started saying this, I think probably, and then 2020 we thought it was real. They actually started dipping their toes, launching private blockchains, etc. Now it really is becoming a lot more real. Like we're in a lot of conversations with these institutions about what their strategy is and like it's tangible. I mean, we see PYUSD hit 1 billion TVL on Solana, obviously highly incentivized. They need to do that to bootstrap liquidity. That's liquidity.
But that's the good part, right? Like these guys have to compete with our native solutions.
Yeah, exactly. But like, I guess what I'm trying to say is like, for me in a year from now, seeing like institutions actually come on chain, like PayPal is a huge win. And I think just, I am going to be focused and I will be happy with just more of like DeFi proliferation, DeFi maturity, stables being used in more real world use cases. Like, I thought Coinbase having effectively like you pay for a pizza, it's $5 and I don't remember the cost, but like $5 for USD, $3 for USDC. That is genius, right? It's like download it. You'll save $2 if you just download and pay in the same thing, but just like effectively the same thing to the user, right? And so like those types of things I get really excited about, and I think sometimes get demonized or pushed to the side because it's not this narrative of like SocialFi or these other things we want to come true. And again, I'm not saying they won't. I'm just saying that it is fine at the very worst if all we do is like solve a lot of these financial use cases. That market is massive.
Yeah, I mean, that's not a small thing, right? Like if we're able to build financial rails on chain, that's enough for me, to be honest. Like I don't care about Instagram on the blockchain. We have an Instagram. So I'm very happy with DeFi. This is not a Vitalik subtweet or like anything, but yeah. And yeah, so like, thanks a lot for doing this. I feel like some of these interop teams like yours are doing God's work in the sense that we're laying the pipes on top of which all of this can be built. It might not be glamorous, but I feel like it's very important. And at some point, it will be glamorous, right? So thanks a lot for your work. Thanks for coming on and giving me your time. I hope we can do this again because this was very fun.
Yeah, no, I had a great time. Like I said, like I think there's a lot more we can talk about. And the thing about interop that's really cool, it's like, and why it's also hard and takes time is you span so much. Not only are you connecting to networks across different virtual machines, you're also working with the applications on those chains. You're also building a bunch of different products that compose with this like really complicated technology. So there's just so much to like dig into. So we'll definitely have to do this again, and I appreciate you having me on.
Awesome. I'm going to end this now.